Today, folks, we're going to be talking about buyer's remorse and Switch 2, because if you've been paying attention over the last few days, at least on YouTube, there's been a particular video that has gone viral talking about how the Switch 2, here's just the video right here. The Nintendo Switch 2's buyer's remorse is very real. My title is a play off of that title because I actually don't think it's as real as he makes it out to be. Now, obviously, we are a Nintendo channel that really enjoys Switch 2. I got mine right here. And obviously, we don't agree with that opinion around these parts. But I also don't think the arguments made in the video make any logical sense and only really apply if you are essentially making an argument for why you shouldn't buy a Nintendo Switch 2. And I want to note that these arguments are coming from a content creator who doesn't own a Switch 2, ergo isn't experiencing buyer's remorse, and therefore probably wouldn't fundamentally understand how or why you could experience buyer's remorse since they have chosen not to buy the platform at this time. So I think it's really interesting because the perspective of buyer's remorse should probably come from someone who's bought the system and actually is experiencing it. Now, I want to note that I'm not claiming that there's nobody out there that has buyer's remorse. The iPhone 17 just released yesterday, and there's probably people that have it right now that regret buying it and aren't experiencing the uplift and upgrade they thought they would feel coming off of the 16. So yeah, buyer's remorse is a thing. There are people that legitimately feel it. But the way the video presents it is as if there is a significant, if not a majority, maybe not majority, it's a bit strong, but a large swath of Switch 2 owners that regret making the purchase. Now, it's interesting as well because this content creator has also in the past suggested that a majority of Switch 2 purchases were actually scalpers. So I guess their buyer's remorse would probably just be they've been failing to resell the system on eBay. So I guess that could be your buyer's remorse. But there are obviously some people who do experience buyer's remorse. They bought it based on hype. They bought it based on hopium. And now, as of today, they maybe regret making that purchase. That's what buyer's remorse is. You buy something and then you regret actually purchasing it. But I don't think that's the way a majority of Nintendo Switch 2 owners feel. And I think that there's a lot of arguments that are brought up in this video that just don't hold any weight when you actually think about what he's saying and what actually was going on online at the time. That being said, folks, before we dive in, I want to remind you of a few things. First off, this video is sponsored by dbrand. This is the dbrand Kill Switch case. It is the perfect case for your Nintendo Switch 2. It does come with a dock accessory, so you can still dock this bad boy right up without taking the case off. It'll protect it from drops. It'll protect it from, well, basically drops, but also it makes it a lot more comfortable to hold as well. So if you are interested in checking out the dbrand Kill Switch, I would say, hey, go ahead down in the link in the description, give it a check. Also down in the description, we have 2 giveaways going on. We're giving away 3 copies of Mario Galaxy 1 plus 2, so technically 6 games, but the bundle of them. Also, we're giving away 5 copies of Kirby Air Riders. To enter, there are appropriate giveaway links down in the description and in the pinned comment. And let's go ahead and dive in. And to understand where this whole argument comes from, because I watched the entire video, apparently months back, he claims that there was an expectation, and he being Nintendine, claims that there was an expectation for Switch 2 that it would be at minimum at a Series S level of power and possibly trade blows, but not be as powerful as a PlayStation 5. Now, I was around for these conversations. We were having these conversations here, and I don't recall anyone actually saying it would be as powerful as a Series S, especially at minimum. We did note that there was more RAM in this bad boy and that it had a different architecture, and DLSS would probably be better than the upscaling technology available to the Series S. But we also knew the Series S had obviously the ability to be plugged into the wall, probably had a much better CPU, and even the GPU, just by nature of it having more power and the RAM probably being higher clocked, that yeah, it probably wasn't as powerful as the Series S, but that it could maybe in some aspects, thanks to DLSS, trade blows. And what have we discovered since launch? Well, Digital Foundry has gone on to confirm that there are several instances where some games on this system have moments where it trades blow with Series S, which is literally what was being talked about before the system was even revealed, before we had that really big direct. So it's fascinating that he's now framing that conversation as what we were really talking about was that at minimum, this would be as powerful as the Series S and be pretty close to, although not quite as powerful as a PlayStation 5. Maybe those conversations existed somewhere. I don't recall that being a big talking point. The bigger talking point was just that, like, hey, there'll be aspects of this that will show that it could do certain things better than a Series S, but wouldn't overall be as powerful as one, but would be more powerful than a PlayStation 4 or PlayStation 4 Pro. And really, people were settling that docked mode wise, it would be between a Pro and a Series S, which is exactly what we've seen from Digital Foundry comparisons. Obviously, for docked mode. In handheld, things we always knew were going to be less, right? That's just the way it goes. There's two different power profiles. Now, I find that interesting that this is a huge premise, because throughout the entirety of the video, he spends the whole time just talking about how this thing isn't as powerful as people expected it to be. And he says that's basically the crux of the buyer's remorse. Now, there's another crux he throws into it about the game library, and we will talk about that because he does make one point I do agree with. But I find this to be interesting that it is the main crux for buyer's remorse, is that, hey, people bought Switch 2 and they're just disappointed with the power of the system. I haven't actually seen that be a popular sentiment online, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that. Next up, he thought, that the average consumer thinks that this is a 4K 60 FPS device. Now, what is an average consumer? He doesn't really define it much, other than somebody who has maybe seen a trailer here or there, or maybe saw the direct. I'm going to tell you right now, the average consumer does not watch Nintendo Directs. Nintendo Directs are for your hardcore faithful. That is not the average consumer base. That is your hardcore fans. The average consumer is basically someone who sees it on a store shelf and goes, oh, that's a Switch 2. That's a new system. The average consumer doesn't pay attention that closely to anything Nintendo. In fact, the average consumer might be more aware of the discourse around the system than anything Nintendo's actually said about it. And I just say that from going to launch and having some more casual consumers in the line buying a Switch 2 that were talking to me about, hey, aren't all the games going to be $90? And it's like, where did they hear that? Because they didn't hear it from Nintendo. Yeah, they heard it from content creators online. They're actually consuming more of this kind of content that we make and other people make than they are Nintendo stuff. The average consumer just isn't paying that close of attention. So no, I don't think any average consumer walked into buying a Switch 2 expecting 4K 60 FPS. Even knowing the device does 4K 60 FPS would have to be a consumer that's actually paying active attention. To know the system does 120 FPS, again, you have to be a consumer that actually pays attention. And I would argue the average consumer isn't paying that close attention. The average consumer doesn't even always know what resolution their damn Xbox Series X is running at. It's really fascinating to me talking about average consumers while not being one, because I'm surrounded by them in my family. And let me tell you, I had to answer a bunch of questions about Switch 2 because they had no idea what the thing even was. In fact, they didn't even know a new Nintendo was coming until I told them. Average consumers are not paying that close attention to the details. So no, the expectation of 4K 60 FPS ain't coming from your average consumer. It's coming from either people who are paying attention to what Nintendo said, or it's just people being negative about Nintendo and wanting to laugh at them for advertising 4K 60 FPS when obviously it's not going to be able to do that in a majority of cases. Confusing people laughing at Nintendo about it to be average consumers is not a smart way to go about this. It would have been better, I think, his video when he was making these points, if he would have actually shown proof that real Switch 2 consumers were saying this stuff. But of course he didn't. It's just, hey, believe me because I said so, right? Next up, he claims that DK Bonanza before launch was being talked about on the same hype levels as a Mario game. And I got a note here that a lot of us that were hyping up DK Bonanza always noted it's not 3D Mario. Like, this is not going to get the attention that a 3D Mario game did. We were saying the quality of the game is at the level of a 3D Mario. But talking about the quality of the game and our expectations of it and our personal excitement for the game for the first 3D Donkey Kong in 26 years is not the same as saying that this has the same hype level as an actual Mario game. At no point do I recall anyone actually hyping this up to have the same level of excitement for a general audience as Donkey Kong. Some of us were as hyped and actually like Donkey Kong more than we enjoyed Super Mario Odyssey. That is actually a real opinion out there. But just because we're hyped about it and excited about it and enjoy it, none of us were acting like this gets the same sort of attention as a Mario game. That doesn't even make sense. I don't know any logical Nintendo fan or anyone playing Switch 2 that expected this to have the same hype level as Mario. And the funny thing is, no Mario game has been announced, like in terms of a brand new 3D or side-scrolling one for Nintendo Switch 2. So I don't know what this point really is, because we're talking about buyer's remorse, and people that bought Donkey Kong seem to be pretty satisfied with Donkey Kong, hence the really high user scores combined with the really high reviews. So I don't really know how that creates any buyer's remorse by having just a really damn good video game come out, because it's not Mario, I guess, is the idea of it being buyer's remorse, but Mario wasn't promised yet. So, okay, moving on. He does this big thing where he tries to basically dismiss all third-party games, either for being old ports coming back, sure, fair criticism, or because they don't perform as well as more powerful systems do, even using Digital Foundry for this argument, even though Digital Foundry has said many times, for the level of hardware this is, a lot of these third-party games are running very, very well, and they've even been impressed, especially with Star Wars Outlaws. They were very impressed. Now, the big thing about noting this is he assumes that a majority of people that bought this own an Xbox, gaming PC, or PlayStation. So his assumption is, for some reason, the early adopters of this platform are multi-platform gamers that literally will not buy multi-platform games on Switch 2 because they're always going to be running better on competing systems. Now, I'm a multi-platform gamer. I own Star Wars Outlaws on Xbox, and I also own it on the Nintendo Switch 2. And you might go, well, Nate, why would you do that? And, well, it's pretty simple. I can't play my Xbox anywhere. It does stream to my phone, but it's very inconsistent when I'm not at home on my Wi-Fi. I would call it an unenjoyable experience when I'm not playing it at home. So this, I could pick Star Wars Outlaws up and play it at the airport. I can play it on the plane. I can play it anywhere. That's one of the major appeals of Switch 2. It's not that the games were ever going to run as well as they do on other platforms. In fact, that was never being stated about this at any point. There were no promises about that, and there were no hype that it was going to be. The hype was always that the games would be good enough that we would actually enjoy them, when so many games were not good enough on Nintendo Switch 1. And lo and behold, the games are good enough. That actually proved to be true. Also, it's really interesting to consider that the early adopter audience is an audience of multi-platform gamers, when I would venture to guess, and this is, I don't know this, there's no way for me to measure this, just like there's no way for him to back up his claim that all the buyers, or a majority of the buyers of Switch 2 are multi-platform gamers. I would venture to guess that a lot of the people that have early adopted Switch 2 so far are people that were Switch gamers that only really played games on Switch. I'm not saying some of you aren't multi-platform gamers, of course, but I just have this venture to guess early adopters are usually your most hardcore audience, and your most hardcore audience primarily only plays games on your platforms. So I would venture to guess a lot of people that bought a Switch 2 only game on Switch. So the way these games perform and the fact that they're old games probably don't matter to most of the people playing on Switch 2. But again, just like he's making an assumption about buyer's remorse over this point here without any actual evidence to it, I'm also trying to be like, well, I've seen, but can't provide enough evidence to suggest that it's a majority, that most of the people who bought this are the hardcore fans, not necessarily the kind of people that would be considering multi-platform gaming on this. Because people who own multiple platforms, this is just my opinion, and maybe this is a crazy thought. If you own multiple platforms, why would you rush out to buy something if you're only going to buy it for the exclusives when the exclusives aren't there yet that you want to buy? You see what I mean? Like, it doesn't make any sense. You're already getting the multi-platform games, so you're only going to buy Switch 2 once enough of Nintendo's games comes out to make you want to buy it. And if the argument that he does make later is that Nintendo hasn't released their big hitters yet, then multi-platform gamers actually have less of a reason to be early adopting a Switch 2. So take that for what you will. Next up, he talks about how He claims to be talking about Switch 2 from the perspective of someone who bought it. He says, like, hey, I'm trying to take the perspective of someone who bought it, who doesn't care about the discourse around it, like all the controversial stuff that people have talked about, but is just trying to play games. And again, I have to note, this is while he himself is not one of those people. He's trying to talk from a perspective that he doesn't know or understand because he's not one of them. He's just reading what people say online and extrapolating it to be a much bigger audience than it is. And I know some people might go, well, look how many views this video got. Look how viral it went. It must be true. We're going to address that actually, because I know some people are thinking that. Many more people are going to watch his video than watch this one. Okay. Got to be clear about that. Nintendo Switch 2 discussion that tends to lean towards the negative does indeed, despite what some people say, garner way more attention online than being positive about the platform does. So yes, his video is going to get way more views than this one, and people are going to use that as evidence. And I want to show you on his own video why that's a little disingenuous to use that as evidence of buyer's remorse, because buyer's remorse can only come from people who actually bought the system. It can't come from people who haven't bought it because they can't feel remorse over something they didn't buy. Buyer's remorse is about buying something and regretting it, okay? If you want to be negative about Nintendo and you are not convinced to buy a Switch 2 and you haven't bought one, you can't be experiencing buyer's remorse. So the video isn't really relevant to you, but the fact this video is so relevant with people that didn't buy it is exactly why it has so many views. But we'll get to that in a moment. He criticizes the lack of major games in August and September, and I don't really disagree with those criticisms. Again, Nintendo kind of chose to really jam everything into the holiday season. So yeah, in terms of Nintendo first party, Dragon Drive, some DLC, Silk Song obviously coming out, Hades 2 here. It's a bit of a sparser lineup, so I do understand that criticism, and I think that is fair. And I'm not even going to counter argue that, because I don't think there really is a good counter argument for that. I think Nintendo intentionally chose to pack the holiday slate because that's when most of their sales happen. When they could have spread out those 5 games and covered one major game each month, they decided not to do that. They're still averaging the same amount of major games per month, but they're packing the holiday. So it is what it is. Example, we have 2 games next month. We have 2 games in November. Those games could have been spread out, but they didn't do that. So let's move on. Now he does say that, claims that people who bought a Switch 2 early own a PC, PS5, Xbox, so they can run the best looking games on Switch 2 even better. We've already kind of addressed that point. He just brings it up multiple times, which I don't think is relevant for early adoption. And I can't prove it, but he can't prove that otherwise. So, I guess it's just who do you want to believe? And then he brings up Fortnite as being worse than playing on the Series S. So, like, why would you play Fortnite on Switch 2? Because millions of people were playing Fortnite on Switch 1. In fact, millions of people still are playing Fortnite on Switch 1. And it's a really bad experience. My son is upstairs playing Fortnite on Switch 1 right freaking now. He got to play one match on my Switch 2, and his mind was blown at how much better the game is on Switch 2. And my fiance, who plays way more Fortnite than I do and plays it on my Xbox Series X, she was playing on my Switch 2 last night while I was playing Madden on the Series X. And you know what she said? You know what? This feels and plays and really similar to the Xbox version. Yeah, it doesn't have to be 1-to-1 to be good enough. The argument about Nintendo Switch 2 was always that it's good enough. And guess what? She was playing in handheld, which you can't do with the Xbox version right now. So the appeal of the Switch 2 has always been the same as the appeal of the Switch 1, that you could play the games anywhere. So yeah, I just find that to be really interesting that now Fortnite is now a bad port on Switch 2, even though it runs at a consistent 60 FPS, which is all that really matters for gameplay purposes. And it's got really great draw distance and very low pop in. You actually can be a competitive Fortnite player on here. Even has mouse support. So, okay, we'll set that aside because I just found that argument to be really weird in a household that does play Fortnite. I have some pretty good experience where most people tend not to care between the other console versions and the Switch 2 one because, again, the argument for third-party support on Switch 2 was always it just has to be good enough. Fortnite's actually a positive example of a good enough experience. Hence why cross-platform play and all that is more enjoyable on Switch 2 because other people don't have that competitive advantage. All right, moving on. He claims the sports games were being advertised as having parity with the other releases, despite the fact that Madden and NBA 2K both advertised before release that there wouldn't be cross-platform play. Anyone who cares about those games knew the moment that cross-platform play was confirmed to not be part of those games that there was obviously something lesser about those experiences. I'm not really sure where it was ever like massively advertised that this was going to be a feature parity. Like, no, they did say that we were going to get the games and they were going to be the current gen versions of the game, but they never promised complete parity. The moment cross-gen support wasn't in, we already knew that meant there was probably something wrong with the performance of the games. And by wrong, we meant less frame rates than the other systems. And lo and behold, that's literally what happened. So they were pretty upfront that these were not the exact same on par versions. They were just the current gen versions, which is an improvement over Switch 1, especially for NBA 2K. It looks visually great. It has all the same in-game features, but it doesn't have 60 FPS. We kind of already knew that. So anyone that paid attention to those games knew the expectation going in was that they would be lower frame rates. So it's kind of weird to use that as an argument for why people feel buyer's remorse. I also don't think a lot of people were picking up Switch 2 for Madden and NBA 2K. I'm just going to be honest here. I don't think that was a major selling point for the platform. Could be wrong here, but this is the same person who said third-party games aren't selling on the system. It's just first-party. He said this like a month ago, and here he's now trying to be like, oh, buyer's remorse exists over something that people probably didn't buy the system for. So I think that's an interesting way. In fact, most of the video talks about third-party stuff, like after he's made arguments for months that we only buy it for first-party. Now, the rest of this obviously gets down to some stuff that I can kind of see some arguments. He claims that the games coming out do actually appeal to Nintendo fans and Nintendo buyers in general, but it just doesn't appeal at the same level as 3D Mario and 3D Zelda, and I do agree with that. All the games announced so far, even like Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, that to me is on the same hype level as a 3D Mario, is not something that has the same general mass appeal to the Nintendo base as a 3D Mario or a 3D Zelda. But, you say that, but then you also say, but you do think people that like Nintendo and buy Nintendo games are probably in general at least satiated with the current lineup, even if not as excited as they would be if one of those two games were announced. And that's cool. I think that's a fair point to make. That would also mean that since I feel like a majority of people that bought Switch 2 is the hardcore audience of Nintendo that probably plays a wide swath of games, you're kind of saying that they would be satisfied, even if not as quite as excited as they could be if 3D Mario or Zelda were announced. But you're saying they'd be satisfied, which is the opposite of buyer's remorse. So you're kind of arguing against your point there. But I will note here that I do think the lack of a 3D Mario, the lack of a 3D Zelda, the lack of a Smash Bros. And Animal Crossing, some of their largest system-selling IPs being announced, I think does affect its appeal on the outside. Like, in terms of trying to gather new consumers to come in, those are some of the biggest games to do that. And not having those games certainly impacts the ability to reach new consumers. But I don't think that it has anything to do with buyer's remorse, because most of the hardcore fans know a lot of those games are coming. We do have to be patient, and it just means that things are only more exciting in the future rather than less, because we're not getting these games now, but we can start looking forward to them in year 2, year 3, etc., where the beginning to middle of the generation starts to be very exciting, and maybe we even have a more exciting end of the generation as well, as we get a slower start to the generation in terms of their major games. Obviously, Nintendo assumes Mario Kart World is a system-selling level game like that, so they kind of feel like they already have one here in the first year, and it probably is a system-selling game. And we'll find out this holiday how many people are picking up like the Pokemon bundle versus the Switch 2 Mario Kart bundle. They're both going to be available this holiday. I think Switch 2 is going to sell incredible because of those bundles, but we'll find out. His last claim I thought was really weird. So he had this claim where he said, if you bought a Switch 2 expecting your Switch 1 games to run better, they don't. And I don't know where this comes from. Yeah, there are 12 games Nintendo released free updates for. Yeah, there's Switch 2 editions of certain games. But I'm not really sure where he got this idea that the games don't run better. Like, he talks about how, it's a 720p image stretched out. Okay, sure. That's the same as true on your TV as well, by the way. The image getting stretched out on your 4K televisions on Switch 1. But he's probably talking about handheld where it's stretched out from 720p to 1080p. That has nothing to do with games not being better. This is from 3 months ago. It's a very old list. A very incomplete list of Switch games that have performance improvements on Switch 2. You're seeing faster loads on average, looks better, runs smoother, 60 FPS with only a drop in a frame here or there, lock 30 FPS, lock 30 FPS, lock 60, 60 uncapped, 60, running smoother, loads faster, higher resolution. Across the board, Switch 1 games run better on Switch 2. And the reason he doesn't know that is because he doesn't own one. He bases so much of his stances on things he digs up online rather than actually having experience. A majority of Switch 1 games play better on here, including Smash Bros. He brings up Smash Bros as an example of a game that just looks worse and doesn't, has no improvements on Switch 2. And yet when you Google, does Smash Bros Ultimate run better on Switch 2? You have the AI overview that matches this Reddit thread from 3 months ago. It says, yes, Super Smash Bros Ultimate generally runs better on Switch 2 due to significantly faster loading times, such as for the title screen, the character selection, the costume changes, and replays. While there's no specific Switch 2 patch yet, the beefier hardware provides smoother performance and faster respawns. However, online play's input delay remains unchanged, although it's more consistent. It's at like a 6 frame instead of a 5 or 6 frame. So for the hardcore people, it's actually a more consistent frame difference there for your timings. But either way, obviously not ideal. There's not like a major online improvement. But point is, yeah, there's even improvements naturally with Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. So that's just a lie. And it's a lie because he doesn't know. Like consistently, he is looking online for things that support his argument. And I feel like this is what's been happening with the discourse around Switch 2 overall, is that people will find things to support their stances because that's all they're looking for. They're not looking for anything else. So when you're just looking for things that support this idea that there's buyer's remorse, you will find people that have buyer's remorse, but you're not considering the people that don't. You have to look at the whole spectrum. And you have to be careful when you say things that you don't have direct knowledge of that are easily disprovable with Google searches, with people making giant lists of things showing that Switch 1 games actually run better on here. One of the primary reasons to buy a Switch 2, I can argue right now, is that your Switch 1 library actually runs better. That is a huge selling point for the platform. But he doesn't know that. And he hasn't even done the research on that. It's weird. But beyond that, let's go back to his video, because I don't want to make this all about like hating on Nintendo. I think he makes some good points, and I think he's actually a pretty intelligent person. I just think sometimes he's only looking for things that support his biases instead of considering a wider breadth. Let's look at the comments on his video, because after all, it went viral, and it's going to get way more views in this video. So clearly, there must be a huge sentiment that has buyer's remorse. Well, we don't have to scroll far to realize what's going on here. Post Nintendo clarity has nothing to do with buyer's remorse. If Nintendo made a Switch 3 tomorrow, the same people would buy it. Look at all the likes. Again, nothing to do with buyer's remorse. Without Reggie Nawada, no one at Nintendo's fighting for the gamers. Nintendo isn't the same anymore. Has nothing to do with buyer's remorse. That's just a negative comment. Next up, when I saw the Switch 2 right back in April, I saw so many red flags that they could blot out the sun. Nothing I've seen since has done anything to dispel the red flags. In fact, the red flags are starting to become flaming red flags. I ignored the Switch 2 entirely and regret nothing. That's not buyer's remorse. You didn't buy it. You can't have buyer's remorse if you didn't buy it. I don't know what Nintendo is doing once their nostalgia market dies off, because there aren't going to be many kids who still have access to the games to be nostalgic later in life. Again, this isn't buyer's remorse. That's not what a buyer's remorse comment is. That's the comment of someone who didn't buy a Switch 2. Skipping Switch 2 is one of the best decisions I made this year. 2.8K likes. Again, that's not buyer's remorse because they didn't buy a Switch 2. Are you seeing the pattern here? None of this is buyer's remorse. This video is blowing up from people who are either mad at Nintendo, don't like Nintendo, or who didn't buy a Switch 2. That's a majority of the audience watching this video. And it keeps going. Buy our overpriced nickel and dime machine so you can play all the games you've been playing for the past 5 years. Again, somebody that clearly didn't buy a Switch 2. Anyone who thought a handheld system was going to do 4K 120 FPS per second deserves to lose their money. Again, this is not someone who bought a Switch 2. Does support up to 120 FPS, like Hollow Knight has shown that. Hollow Knight is also basically playable on a potato. So this is just excusing, how well it runs, and then just, probably didn't buy a Switch 2. You don't hate Nintendo enough. By far the most real words in gaming. I like how they priced out any kids that would want to Switch 2 only to make the least mature and safest games they can make. See what I mean? Over and over again, all these comments that are getting all the likes and all the attention and driving all the views are people that don't like Nintendo or just don't like the Nintendo Switch 2. And that's okay that they don't. But it creates a bad narrative that there is a massive amount of people who bought a Switch 2 that have buyer's remorse because videos like this are going viral. But they're going viral due to people who literally didn't buy the system and don't have buyer's remorse. So no, my conclusion is there isn't this massive buyer's remorse from people who bought a Switch 2. But if I'm wrong, let me know down below. As always, folks, I'll catch you in the next video.